Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Resilient Communities webinar series. I'm Linda Durhack, an Energy and Climate Outreach Associate at Illinois Extension, and I will be your moderator for this session today. Today, we will be learning about energy resilience and what we can do to prepare for the next outage. I know we've had a lot of big storms and tornadoes the past few weeks here in Illinois, so I know this topic continues to be very relevant for many of us. This webinar series is hosted, as always, in partnership with Prairie Rivers Network, and I'd like to thank both Randa Watts and Mike Delaney for all of their support in coordinating this webinar with me. We have also partnered with Illinois APA to offer CM credits for this webinar. So first, we'll be going over some general guidelines before getting to our speaker introductions. We are recording this webinar. You will get a link to the recording and contact information for the speakers in the next few days, along with slides. You can always find local government education webinars on our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions along the way, always feel free to put those in the chat. Speakers may answer throughout the presentation, but we will also have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. As I mentioned before, we are offering CM credits for this webinar. For certified planners, this webinar is worth 1 CM credit thanks to the American Planning Association Illinois chapter. You can log into myapa@planning.org and search by the webinar title or event number 9331172 to find the event. Put that up for a moment. Okay. So we have a quick, exciting update before we introduce our speakers. This week, we relaunched the Resilient Communities newsletter. It includes updates and resources from Extension's energy and climate teams and Prairie Rivers Network. It will include information on upcoming and past webinars as well. So expect to see this in your inbox once a month. Now, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Todd Rusk, who is the Associate Director of the EnergySense Resilience Center. He has led this organization since 2024, directing the staff of 16 to successful completion of 2.5 million plus per year in externally funded programs, and is responsible for the oversight of the staff and the delivery of the unit's energy, climate, and sustainability programs. Current and recent work includes energy audits for buildings and water treatment processes, energy and climate action planning for large government agencies and for communities, solar feasibility assessment implementation support, and program launch and operational support for statewide clean energy workforce and contractor development programs. And he will be sharing with us climate action planning and an introduction to energy resilience. So let's go welcome Todd.
Thank you, Linda. And thanks everyone for joining. I am glad to be here and present a little bit about connection between resilience, energy resilience planning, climate action planning, and energy efficiency planning. My background is mechanical engineering and energy engineering, and my perspective is informed by a role providing technical assistance. So with that, I will, and my slides are showing okay?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we are a service unit at the University of Illinois system, and our mission is to empower organizations. So you can see our mission statement there. We're a small but mighty team, and we provide technical assistance with all kinds of programs and projects related to energy efficiency planning, climate action planning, adjacent to energy resilience and sustainability. So we are technical assistants in a program implementation shop housed in the University of Illinois system. So we're part of the Illinois Innovation Network, which is a network of all of the state universities of Illinois under the Office of the Vice President for Economic Development and Innovation, the University of Illinois system. So we serve communities and businesses and public agencies, a lot of different kinds of services. And so when we think about energy resilience, I think a lot about the connections with energy efficiency and implementation, climate action planning. If we have efficient, sustainable buildings and landscapes, those will also tend to be resilient. And I could go through all of these little icons and talk about how they connect to energy resiliency. But I'm just gonna kind of jump in here and talk a little bit more about our technical assistance programs. So we do a lot of on-site work with individual facilities. These could be manufacturers, these could be commercial buildings, these could be community college, university, state agency facilities, all around the state. I like to think of us as your energy geeks. To really get into the nitty gritty in your buildings and your infrastructure. So here's what I want to talk about today. Lay out a little bit of background to energy resilience, talk about a framework for planning and implementation, talk about some examples from Illinois, and then throughout the slides, I will give examples of program resources and funding and incentive programs that could help your community along the way as you go on your journey and your planning and implementation processes. So just to start with at the high level, what do we mean when we're talking about resilience? You probably all have your own ideas. I thought it'd be helpful to just bring in a couple of different definitions. One is a national laboratory. That's the National Laboratory of the Rockies. So there's a definition there, and then also our own Illinois EPA Office of Energy. So when we look at the first one, we're talking about uh, anticipating and preparing for and adapting for changing conditions. And in the second half of that definition, it's also talking about then being able to withstand and respond and to recover from disruptions in those things. So what you'll notice is that it doesn't, none of this makes us uh, uh, none of this prevents outages. None of this is to, reduce our disruptions to zero, but we want to uh, be able to get in front of, uh, harden our infrastructure and our facilities, and be able to get planning processes in place so that we can recover and gradually improve our systems, buildings, and infrastructure over time. Illinois EPA offers a definition that is very similar. Um, um, and one of the things that they also add on there are some of the benefits of addressing energy resiliency. So, we improve our power outage recovery. That means our businesses can get back online in our homes and in our communities. We can get back to business, doing living our lives and doing the mission of our agencies and businesses. We have more energy efficient, comfortable buildings that cost less to operate. Um, and if we have more resilient infrastructure, our businesses are going to be more consistent and able to see the opportunity for operating in an area and to just, keep operating business as usual with minimal disruptions to operating their services. So both of those I offer links for both of those in case you want to dig into those. So, some thoughts on planning and implementation. Uh, when I think about energy resilience planning, it can be very similar to how we plan for energy efficiency, how we do climate action planning, and how we even do capital project planning. And so I keep drawing these parallels because if if in your community you can integrate it with processes for planning and upgrades and improvements that are already in place, then then you can kind of get quicker to making your improvements if it's not addressed as some standalone special kind of thing, but instead you have a resilience planning process, and that is integrated with your other community plans. So what we have up here is a graphic for energy management and energy efficiency planning processes. It's you might recognize as a typical plan, do, act kind of process. So I'll just run through those a little bit, and then also some resources up here on planning, and then also call your attention to um, uh, a resilience planning guide from and roadmap from the National Laboratory of the Rockies. It's at the bottom of the page there. So any robust planning process is going to start with commitment, especially from the organizational leadership, elected officials. So developing an initial vision. What's the purpose? What does success look like? Assembling your team. Who are all the stakeholders? Want to make sure that we grab the experience and the key stakeholders that are within your municipality or your organization, but then allied organizations and then other stakeholders like businesses and residents. And then establishing policy really helps to cement and firm up your commitment and accountability for making progress on those plans. Part of our planning process is assessing infrastructure. So we want to think about the scope of the assessment. What facilities or infrastructure do we want to enhance the energy resilience? So I list a bunch of facility types. There might be others that you are thinking of, but those are some common ones. Um, Assemble subject matter experts. If you don't have all the subject matter expertise that you would need in-house, you can look to outside experts. So definitely want to capture your in-house expertise with your facilities and planning staff. Um, uh, we can be support. Um, and then, of course, there's your contractors and engineering firms, energy service companies, and the utility programs can also be a source of support. Then establishing your baseline and identifying opportunities for improvement. Uh, what are your goals? That's after you do your assessment, setting your goals, creating action plan, implementation. Again, this is very similar to how we would do a climate action plan, how we would do a facilities energy planning process. So when we do our assessment, we identify recommendations, especially the short term and the long term ones. What are your initial priorities based on what's easier, relatively higher impact and lower cost. Uh, and we can also think about even some more longer term measures that happen to be well aligned with capital plans or capital projects that might already be in the works or uh, coming up where there's still an opportunity to affect the design of those capital projects. And then for the longer term measures, you want to develop plans and find ways to integrate those longer term plans with your capital planning and your strategic planning, comprehensive plans, whatever you implement and use in your community for uh, establishing community project priorities and getting those phased in and funded. Um, so setting goals and creating your action plan and implementation, funding is always an issue. And so some sources that you can look to outside of your own tax base or your own internal funding. Um, Illinois Finance Authority is a great source. They have the Illinois Climate Bank, so there's revolving loan funds, there's grant programs. The Illinois EPA has programs. There's You can do financing through commercial property assessed clean energy financing, even if you're not a taxable, or even if you are a nonprofit or an entity uh, that doesn't pay taxes, you can still take advantage of commercial PACE financing. There's utility incentives that can help lower the cost of implementation. And then there's also financing that could be through performance contracting, could be through energy as a service. So part of your planning is going to be figuring out where do you get the resources? How do you find those resources so you can implement those programs? I also want to put in front of you some other resources. Um, some existing and upcoming programs that you uh, should pay attention to because there are going to be programs coming online that will be helpful and perhaps provide additional funding or other resources to help you with your planning and implementation. So there's the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, known as CEJA. Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity operates a lot of those programs. Some of them are explicitly targeted towards communities and contractor development programs for doing improvements in communities. So you can check those out. There are solar programs through the Illinois Power Agency. Um, and then you can also pay attention to some new and up and coming programs through the Illinois Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. There's a slate of programs, technical assistance, and also incentives that can help you with identification and implementing some of the measures. And then a recently passed legislation in Illinois, sometimes referred to as SURGA, that's the Clean and Reliable Grid Affordability Act. Um, and specifically in the context of resilience, I know there's a lot of interest in energy storage and battery energy storage systems. So there are some specific provisions and supports within the programs under SURGA. So I want to highlight some examples of projects, programs, communities that have implemented things that might be a source of inspiration for some of you in your communities. So for identifying funding and financing, you can often get help from local community action agencies, for nonprofits to help provide expertise and staffing support, capacity support to identify and apply for funding opportunities. So I have a couple examples of here. Of course, we have one of our hosts, Prairie Rivers Network. I'd like to point to an example of some work with village of Carrier Mills. There was a Rural Communities Prize, and they worked with Prairie Rivers Network to get funded. And then we worked with that group to provide some energy assessments for some of the facilities in that area. Another community, Rochelle, Illinois, worked with Black Hawk Hills Regional Council, the local regional planning commission in that area, and they applied for Illinois EPA funding for energy action planning. They have a local municipal utility as opposed to the investor-owned utilities. And so they are really interested in long-term uh, long-term planning that will improve the resilience and the reliability of their grid. So they're interested in storage, they're interested in renewables and energy efficiency that will help maintain the reliability of their local Rochelle municipal utility system and be a benefit to the communities, the three municipalities that utility is serving. Climate action planning and energy efficiency planning. We've done a lot of work with Illinois Department of Natural Resources on their climate action plan and implementation. And we've also done some work with the Cook County Forest Preserves. They have done some long-term sustainability and energy action planning. Both of these groups have plans for, they have goals for net zero emissions by 2050. They both explicitly call for resilient natural areas as part of the charge of their planning processes. And they're both good examples of, of planning processes, climate action planning processes that are linked to their capital planning processes, and I call that out explicitly with the forest preserves. They just released their capital improvement plan for 2026, and that contains a number of references to sustainability projects that emerged from their sustainability planning and building energy action planning. Another example with this is another a community college. This is Joliet Junior College. We've done work with them through different state level programs and also through the the Illinois Green Economy Network, a consortium of Illinois community colleges. And this college has a long-term history of engagement with energy efficiency planning and implementation, with climate action planning, and in some recent work with them, we had a success story that I thought would be interesting to highlight in this case. This is an example of one of those low-hanging fruit measures that can be implemented quickly. We identified some opportunities for them to adjust their HVAC settings, and they implemented this. It didn't cost anything for them to implement other than their staff time, and resulted in 10% total energy cost savings at that campus. So that was a successful project for them. And then we also, when we think about energy resiliency, we want to remember the resiliency and the robustness of our local businesses and communities. And so I want to highlight three communities in Illinois that have been engaging with in green business program services. So these are programs that help to uplift businesses that are doing sustainability, climate action planning, that are implementing measures to reduce the environmental impact of their businesses. And these recognition programs and technical assistance support programs are very impactful for these businesses. So I have links for each of those programs. They might be interesting models to think about business engagement in your communities. My last example, and then I'm going to wrap up, wastewater treatment plant. We think about our critical infrastructure. I know that a later presenter is probably going to allude to hospitals, but we also need to think about our utilities and our water infrastructure. And so here's a small community in Illinois, Heron, Illinois. We did an assessment through the Illinois EPA Public Water Energy Efficiency Program, identified some uh, pump improvement measures at this plant. And what we found was that several years after implementation, when we looked at their track record of cost savings, um, they they realized a simple payback of less than 2 years on the cost of the improvements that they did. So good energy savings opportunities at our critical infrastructure facilities. So I'm going to wrap it up there. There's my contact information, EnergySense Resilience Center. Appreciate the opportunity, and I'll be online if there's any questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd. We really appreciate you providing those Illinois examples of how other communities are building energy resilience. With that, we will introduce our second speaker, Damon Taugher, who is the Vice President of Operations and Partnerships at Collective Energy. He's been working with more than 400 health centers nationwide to develop solar microgrids. He's worked in health centers for over 20 years and began his career at nonprofit Direct Relief in 2003. He went on to found Direct Relief's US-based work supporting health centers and other nonprofit medical providers, raising over 100 million in grants and operating funds and distributing over a billion in medical aid. I'll turn it over to you, Damon.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's great to have this opportunity. Looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about the work that Collective Energy does and kind of focusing specifically on how microgrids work and how they can benefit communities, particularly rural communities. And we have a specific emphasis on working with nonprofit health facilities in particular, but this is applicable to many different types of facilities. I'm going to go through the presentation today and kind of focus a little bit on kind of how the process works, some of the things to consider, how the systems are beneficial, and then end with a little bit of a case study example of one health center that we've worked with in a rural community, and then just a mention on some of the work we're doing with the Department of Energy and building out microgrids in the Southeast. Um, okay, yeah. So briefly, here's a summary of kind of the work that we do at Collective Energy. So we're kind of myself and the co-founder focused on actually coming out of the emergency relief areas. My bio had mentioned I worked in Direct Relief, which is a nonprofit humanitarian relief organization that works all over the country, works internationally as well. What we found in doing a lot of our work, I was there for 20 years, responding to disasters from Hurricane Katrina to Maria, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Harvey, just a series of different events all over the US, is that when we'd arrive to help provide, at that time it was the provision of donated medicines to help communities and first responders, many of the health facilities didn't have power, so they weren't able to function. So we were, kind of stuck. You'd have doctors ready and willing to help, but, those at the hospitals required to have backup power, but that wasn't true for a lot of primary care clinics and particularly in underserved communities. So it would create some extra strain. So the purpose of the Collective Energy is now focused on helping those health providers understand the benefits of microgrids and how they can provide more resilience, providing operational stability, cost savings, and then, obviously up to the provider themselves, but they can also assist with first responders as well. So I think as Todd had kind of alluded to, we're seeing increased demand for electricity prices across the board. You're seeing more frequent outages. The U.S. is suffering from an aging grid that very much needs to be updated and upgraded, related to just an increased use in electricity. You're also seeing costs rise. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has seen average costs rise about 6% every year over the past 5 years. And all analysts think that those costs are just going to continue. Obviously, we've read a lot about the demand of AI and data centers. There's increasing electrification. And so All of that is to say that a lot of providers that we work with are facing higher costs and greater instability in receiving their power. So what we've tried to do is to come in and work, and I'll talk a little bit about a partnership that we have, but to help educate providers on how microgrids work, provide kind of free design solutions so that they can understand what type of power consumption they have today, how might that translate into a solar system with backup battery, and then looking at financing options. We know that these systems can be expensive, large capital projects, although in many cases they do provide pretty quick time, returns on investment and cost savings overall, particularly in light of the fact that with electricity rates increasing at their current rate and what their projected rates are, this kind of helps fix costs for these providers. And then we are actually a builder as well. So we work to develop projects and can work with installers locally all around the country. So I think probably many of you are familiar, but it's just helpful to know. Some people think microgrid and they think, oh, this is, independent of the, my working with my utility, and it's sort of an off-grid system. The systems that we design are not that. They are tied into the grid. So at their core, they're solar panels on your roof, in your parking lot. If you're a facility that has land, you can do ground mount systems, all of which then feed your building, and then a battery. And those batteries can be designed at different sizes to do different things, kind of depending upon what the goals of the project are. And then they're tied into the grid as well. What we look to design is all of our batteries are designed to help the facility stay open at minimum a 4-hour period, but we can often build bigger batteries that will last 8 hours, if not more. So that would kind of ensure continuity. This is taking into account, of course, the geographic location of the facilities and looking at different panel layouts based on where the facility is located. And again, what those goals are. If resiliency is the main goal, then it's building a very large battery. Those batteries can then be fed either, via being tied into the grid, and then of course via the panels themselves. And then they're designed to instantaneously shut over if a power loss occurs, so suffering no kind of operational downtime. And then the benefit of these new modern batteries is they take very little, if any, maintenance. It's mostly just monitoring to ensure that they're kind of programmed to design to support the circuits effectively, and that they're receiving the panel power. But they don't require a lot of the maintenance like traditional generators do, where you're needing to test continually. You need to have generally contracts to ensure maintenance occurs. And then for diesel generators, you're looking at also ensuring that you have available fuel supplies to operate those. And then, of course, there are major environmental benefits compared to natural gas or diesel generators, where these systems don't pollute. So the batteries are a big, kind of new focus. Solar has been around for well over 40 years, and is, rapidly growing across the country. And more you're seeing states like California, for example, kind of shift the way in which they incentivize the way solar works, pairing it with batteries increasingly becoming more important. If you look at the way that, state supported incentive programs existed, and federal also, you're seeing the kind of reduction in price associated with panels, often through incentive programs, but increasingly the batteries are incented because they can do multiple things. Of course, a battery provides backup power at its core, but they can also do, time of use charges, or kind of arbitrage associated with. Increasingly, many states are looking at, charging additionally high rates from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., for example, when everybody comes home to work and they plug in their cars, they turn on their TV, they check their email at home, they do all the things associated with power consumption, and so you'll see rates increase. Batteries are now smartly designed to be able to handle specific settings so that it can reserve power, and then maybe you're taking power from the grid from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m., but then 4 p.m. until 8 a.m. where power costs are the highest. You're just using that sun captured battery that was stored during the day, and so you're avoiding the costs of those extra fees and rate increases. So batteries can do a lot of different things. And obviously, in addition to the arbitrage, one of the areas of focus that we have on health facilities is extraordinarily beneficial to keeping medicines refrigerated, having backup power to ensure that medicines are refrigerated and that the health facility doesn't have to close. Many of the providers that we support are sort of able to exist based on Medicaid reimbursements. And if their facility closes due to an outage, insurance generally doesn't cover the loss of revenue, either from spoiled medicines or from the lack of being able to bill for patient visits, and having to reschedule those is very difficult for many of the providers that we support. And so, looking at big losses across the board, about $46,000 in a survey that we did with a couple of different groups with 82 health facilities in the South, found that it was on average about a $46,000 loss, and it could get as high as a couple $100,000 if vaccines are lost. So obviously they have microgrids then have benefits for those health providers on the financial side, as I mentioned, fixing costs, reducing the threat of the loss of medicines, medical supplies. They provide operational capacity, so confidence that your facility is not going to go down during an outage and you can continue to operate just as you normally could. And then they obviously have the benefits that they can be integrated into community preparedness and planning efforts with first responders, with local public health departments, county response agencies, for example. And we've seen a whole range of services, some of which are associated with, they're providing, the ability for patients to charge their phones in the event of a major outage so they can communicate with people if their homes lose power. Or in more advanced cases, we're seeing some of our providers step into full kind of resilience hubs, which you have probably heard of, where they're operating as heating or cooling shelters. So during big peak weather events, allowing patients who are medically vulnerable to come in and be in an air conditioned room during outages, or if it's also very cold and a winter storm knocks out power, you can come into the health provider and receive services. So we get the word out through kind of a cool partnership. We work primarily with federally qualified health centers and rural health facilities through the National Association of Community Health Centers. We have a partnership that's lasted a couple years with them. They have a large membership of about 1,500 entities and 15,000 clinical sites across the country. So they're helping us kind of work on messaging and educating efforts. We're sort of then providing sort of services associated with how do these systems work and providing design work. And then we also have a CDFI lending partner. And I think Todd had mentioned this as well. There are many types of these partners, a lot of lending money available at lower costs than what your traditional lenders might offer. And they actually have a product that's specific to helping health facilities afford the costs of solar, and looking at leveraging the kind of federal tax incentives and direct pay rebates associated with these systems, and the loan to help bring costs down to make them more affordable. And then we also partner with a series of different foundations and sort of resilience-minded supporters from nonprofits and foundations to help identify grant resources that are available to make these projects more affordable. We're finding that there are more and more foundations that are interested in trying to support this type of work, particularly as federal solar subsidies expire, not batteries, which I'll mention. So that the kind of the changing landscape that exists for providers that are interested in understanding how they can afford these systems is it's always to ensure to look at your state and local foundations, state incentive programs to be able to help make these partnerships happen. So we don't just work with urban facilities. We have a bunch of different projects that we've done all around the country. The green ones there are rural facilities that we've supported, and they have particularly needs because there are fewer alternatives for their patients to go receive care if there is an outage. So this is kind of just the general process. This is, how kind of we work, but there are, any provider that does what we do will hopefully take you through these steps. And I think it's helpful just to give you a sense of, if we're thinking about this, what does this even look like? And I'm going to show you, kind of walk you through what that kind of process looks like so you can kind of understand what you might need to do and then who at your facility, if you're interested in understanding what it could look like for the organization that you work for, who to get involved from your finance folks, your operational folks, and then your executives. But looking at a screening that gives you sort of an estimate then by analyzing your utility bills, looking at total power consumption over the course of an entire year, looking at the layout of your facility, and then understanding what your goals are. That will then move from an initial estimate to kind of get you started with a rough number to then a final design, which then provides, on-site analysis of looking at your roof, how old it is it structurally sound, what else needs to be done as far as the potential of running trenching for cables, hookups where the battery would be placed, and really getting permitting and engineering kind of handled. Then looking at getting quotes from local providers, local installers to bid on those plans, and then engaging those installers to actually do the system, and then all the way through inspection and interconnection. I think it's important to note too that what we see across the country is as utilities, more folks are going towards solar, utilities are responding, but the permitting process can take a long time. The inspection process can take a long time. So the projects are typically anywhere from 18 to 24 months until you have a system that's functioning. So here's an example again of what a screening would look like. So here's a health facility, and in this one, it's looking at how to place panels on the roof. You see in yellow there, and then in the parking lot. It's important to note these canopy structures are steel, typically minimum 9 feet, sometimes as high as 12 or 15 feet. They do not take up parking spaces. They also have some added benefits of providing shade during hot times, and they can help keep spots from filling up with snow as well when there are snowy events. And then looking at battery systems that then are going to incorporate that, the resilience that's required as part of those goals. So it's really an analysis of what your current rates of electricity are and how much you use, and then looking at an analysis. Helioscope is typically performed to look at your location, and then kind of combining then that location, what that roof looks like, what that parking spot looks, or the parking lot looks like, potentially open land, and how to design enough panels to be able to offset as much as the power as possible. So in many cases for health facilities, it's been more difficult to get 100% offset, although I have an example where we'll show you that we have done that. But getting an analysis of in a complete year is really important of electricity bills, not just a single month, because electricity usage changes potentially very dramatically as air conditioning is run during the summer or heating is run during the winter. So a full picture of what usage looks like over the course of the year, and then an analysis of what the costs are of the bills, and that's associated with use and then fees from the utility, and then doing an analysis that allows you to understand what that cost looks like. And then you'll see direct pay here. I think Todd had mentioned this. If you're a nonprofit facility, you're able to qualify under the Inflation Reduction Act for a rebate. And then if you're a for-profit agency or for-profit company, rather, you can benefit from a tax credit. So two ways. Unfortunately, the solar rebates and credits are expiring on July 4th. Due to new federal legislation, but there are remaining 30% federal incentives for battery systems. So it's important to think about the cost of the battery. 30% of that can be given back in the form of a rebate from the federal government through the Inflation Reduction Act. And then you should be able to analyze a pro forma. Anytime you get a system estimate, you should see what the numbers look like over a 25-year period, which is typically how long the panels are warranted. In that, you should understand how those, the utility savings are going to occur based on the offset of your electricity, what those rebates are going to look like, and then what the cash flow and when will that system hopefully pay itself off. In this case, we're seeing it year 6. It's paid itself off And then you should also be aware of when warranty periods expire. So panels are typically 25 years, and that requires them to function at least, I think, at 80% of their total original production capacity at that 25-year mark. So very long. They're very simple devices and been around a long time. But the two other big pieces that you should definitely ask about is inverter replacement and battery replacement when those warranties are. We factor those into any of our analyses so that you understand what those costs look like. Batteries these days are getting better and better. They're 12 to 15 years. We're seeing them function longer, but those are typically a lot of what current warranties are. And then inverters often at year 16 and or so, 15, 16 is where we're seeing that. So I think as we kind of close here, that's at a very high level on kind of how that process works, and then giving, the numbers to your CFO or your executive team to understand, is this something that's going to be a fit for us? And then going forward and selecting your local installer and then getting your system built. And I thought I'd talk about just a quick example with one of the providers that we've been working with for a number of years. This is a great federally qualified community health center along the border in Arizona, the U.S.-Mexico border. It's Chiricahua Community Health Centers. It's a very large FQHC. They're the kind of the sole primary care provider for underserved community residents in Cochise County. About 125,000 people live there, but it's a huge area, about 6,200 square miles. They came to us looking to understand, how they could have more resiliency. They suffer from a lot of outages. The grid is not very stable in their area. And then they're also kind of, although they're in the desert, they get hit by, of course, extreme heat, but also monsoons. And then they've had some wildfires as well. So they wanted to ensure that their facilities could stay open. So we kind of took a look, and I'll show you very quickly, kind of looking at how panels worked for this specific facility, and looking at then putting together a package that helped them leverage a kind of a form of payment that we offer, other providers offered as well, which is effectively a lease arrangement, but also bringing in some grant funding that they found to reduce the total cost of the system, and then leveraging the investment tax credit. So they have a number of facilities all over the county. We looked at 4 sites that they wanted to prioritize that were most important to them. So one of the sites you can see here on the left from this aerial image didn't really have a roof that was all that suitable for solar. So they opted to do a carport canopy system instead. And we were able, even with that system not being on the roof, being able to offset 100% of their electricity usage, actually for all of these, which I'll show at the end. The second site there, this one, I believe it also has a fully functioning pharmacy in it, and it's a great big flat roof, and so able to put a lot of panels on that. And then being in Southern Arizona, it produces a ton of power. 2 other examples of smaller buildings with panels didn't have parking that really made sense to put canopy structures in, but again, worked on the roof. And the benefit here overall is that we were able to provide for all 4 of these designs, 100% of their electricity usage is going to be offset by the microgrid, which is great. About 312 total panels, and it provides over 500 kilowatts of energy storage. So that means every site will have full redundancy via the microgrid. And then just mentioning this as, I think one of the things obviously in this industry is just looking at cost and understanding where folks are, but there are different arrangements to consider. So leveraging the Inflation Reduction Act, again, as a nonprofit, that is called direct pay. When you basically start your system, you file with the IRS, you receive a number, a project number associated with that. And then once the project is turned on and you have information from your utility that it's working through what's called permission to operate, you send proof of that the next time you file your 990, and then you use that number and then show those costs, and then you can get 30% of the battery's cost back in the form of a payment if you're a nonprofit. And then if you're for profit, that just comes back as an investment tax, or sorry, as a tax credit that helps bring down the cost of the system. So we offer what's called an energy service agreement. A lot of folks know it as a power purchase agreement. That's basically a long-term lease where somebody else builds the system and owns it on the building. And instead of that provider paying their utility for the power, they pay whomever put the system on, and that allows them to fix their costs over the lifetime of the system. And then actually the IRS, after 5 years of ownership, allows the provider or the entity that has installed the system to buy that system back. The benefit there is that that might provide better financial planning for you to be able to then consider saving money and then buying that system back. And when you buy it back, you'll have had reduced the cost of the system by that 30%. So that's what Chiricahua Community Health Center did in this example. And then lastly, as we close on time here, again, appreciate you sticking with me. But we are doing this type of design. So a couple of years ago, we were part of with that group that I had mentioned, the National Association of Community Health Centers and Capital Link Capital Fund, and another organization called Clean Energy Group. We won a $57 million federal award. This is aimed at building 125 of these types of microgrids for rural health centers all over the Southeast. It's aimed at communities of 10,000 people or less. We're just about to hit the first year of the program and have done the initial selection of the sites, have designed all the systems. With some of the changes in the DOE, we're now looking at an extension of moving into the next period where we're actually begin to build it and then start to plan for that next set. But the nice thing is in this case, these providers are going to be able to get 70%. There's a cost share component for this award, but 70% of the costs will be paid by the federal government, so that 30% of the costs to get the system are needed to be borne by the health centers, but they can still leverage that 30% battery tax credit as well as these projects go forward. So kind of helps make them more affordable. The purpose there is to add more community resiliency in the health system, preventing patients during an outage from not being able to go to their community health center and instead requiring them to go to a hospital that may be already overburdened providing patient care. So that's a little bit of a perspective on sort of the work that we do, how microgrids work, and some of their benefits. My contact information is here, and happy to chat, answer any questions that we might have or you may have for us. But yeah, appreciate you all offering us some time to share our thoughts with you. Thanks so much.
That was extremely helpful, Damon. Thank you so much. I'm glad that you had some examples and also that you brought up direct pay and other ways of financing these systems, because that is one of the first questions we get. And there's just so many different ways that it can be really confusing for folks. So I'm very glad we also have your slides. We are open for Q&A now. So if you have some questions, feel free to put those in the chat. I know me and Randa have also been writing our own questions throughout this presentations. Damon, we have a question for you. So you mentioned, having power purchase agreements for these solar systems. So, if an extreme event does damage these panels, with that PPA, how does that work with the insurance
Yeah,
for
good,
repairing
great,
those?
great question. Yeah, very, very great question. Yeah, so in that case, if you do a PPA, whether with what we offer or with anybody that does a PPA, we refer to them as energy service agreements. We insure them and we have ownership, or whomever is providing the lease arrangement has that responsibility. So one of the benefits there is that the entity that has the system, and if it does get damaged for some reason, they're not responsible for fixing it. The way that the arrangement works is, they're paying for those services. And so it's basically paying over the cost of the system over the lifetime of the system. So the builder is incentivized, or the owner is incentivized to have that fixed as quickly as possible. And they also are providing an operations and maintenance contract to ensure full production of the panels. One thing I should have probably mentioned is panels are very simple, in their structure, but they do need to be cleaned. And so as part of that PPA or energy service agreement relationship, they'll have a maintenance contract to ensure the panels are both maintained. And then to this question, if there were damage, they would be repaired as soon as possible because otherwise, the whomever owns the system would be out of that production
Mm-hmm.
ability and then not be able to charge what the sort of estimated rates are. So that operations and maintenance contract is really key. If you go
Mm-hmm.
down that PPA, ESA route, then it's not the responsibility of the entity to worry about it. It's the responsibility of
Okay.
the owner of the system.
Thank you. That is great to know. We've got a question for Todd here. So you mentioned many different programs that Illinois offers. I'm just curious, as you've been working with communities, are there sources of funding that you've seen that stack well for these projects, like using multiple sources to do an energy resilience project?
I think they all like to stack with each other.
Hmm.
There's a rare program or a rare funding source that is just going to fund everything.
Hmm.
So some of the programs, like some of the DCEO programs that I mentioned, like Equitable Energy Futures and Community Solar Sovereignty, those are programs that help provide funding for planning and feasibility and pre-construction. They don't fund the actual construction. And then we've got some of the other programs that are, they will help offset the cost of the purchase and the installation.
Okay. Have you had success working with communities where maybe they access some of that planning and then they're able to like move on and get like the next step and the next step, like it stacks over time?
Well, that's the idea.
Hmm.
So the DCEO programs that I mentioned are relatively new, and so we're just seeing the first of those. So I don't yet have good case studies of
Mm.
those that have progress. But one of the ways that those projects are evaluated is on the capital stack that they're bringing. Are they bringing other financing, and are they identifying other funding sources once they're, past that feasibility gate?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We have one more question here. So I'm curious, when you're using solar and battery storage, is it more, when you're doing the feasibility, how often do you look into if the extreme weather's happening in the summer versus the winter? You know, does that affect how big you would make that system, depending on what kind of event you're trying to prepare for?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think that's a big part of that initial analysis is looking at a complete year's worth of um, usage. There are a couple of ways that that can happen, one of which you can just log into your utility provider's API and look at your billing history and download those bills. There's
Mhm.
also a service called Utility API that you can Google that allows you to share without sharing a password, but allows you to have somebody else come in and look at your entire bill. So it prevents you from having to kind of wrangle getting login and all that information up. It just allows permission. So that gives you the data that you need. And your question is, yeah, very apt because in summer months and in winter months, depending upon your location, you're going to see spikes in usage of your electricity. It's not a flat
Mhm.
usage rate. We've never really seen that. So you'll see spikes in the south, in particular, where HVAC systems, where AC systems are running all day long, or in the winter in northern climates where you have heating that's happening. So ensuring that you have a full picture of your usage is really important then to
Mhm.
assigning the number of panels that are going to be able to support that usage. So yes, a full year's worth is very important because electricity usage varies greatly over the course of the year.
Yes. Well, thank you so much to you both for presenting and joining us. We are at the end of the hour, so thank you to everyone else for joining this presentation. We will send out a recording and the slides and their contact information if you would like to follow up. As a reminder, we are taking July off from the webinar, but we'll be back in August to talk about solar and wildlife impacts and agrivoltaics. So we hope to see you there. And until then, enjoy your summer.